Trump administration is taking aim at a major Canadian export. The U.S. Commerce Department is hiking anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber to 20.56%.
The softwood lumber industry is taking a hit because of significant new duties from the United States. Alberta's biggest softwood lumber market, but BC may be hit the hardest.
On lumber going across the line is just ridiculous. There's over 250 small manufacturing family-run companies like us in BC. It's going to kill thousands of jobs.
In recent months, the American housing market has been rocked by a crisis. Few expected, but many now feel deeply. At the center of this storm lies a major timber giant's sudden collapse. A company that once formed a backbone of the U.S. lumber supply chain. This event has sent ripples throughout the construction and housing industries. Compounding problems already present due to soaring costs and limited housing availability. The timber giant's failure is not an isolated incident. It is the culmination of years of trade tensions, market shifts, and policy decisions, particularly those surrounding tariffs imposed on Canadian softwood lumber. These tariffs, introduced and escalated during the Trump administration, aimed to protect American lumber producers from competition deemed unfair. However, instead of strengthening the domestic market, these tariffs contributed to unprecedented price increases and a disrupted supply chain. This documentary will explore the roots of the crisis, unpack the impact of tariffs on lumber prices and the housing market, and explain how the collapse of a key industry player has pushed the U.S. housing sector toward a breaking point. We'll also discuss the broader social and economic consequences from first-time homebuyers being priced out of the market. Why do workers in forestry and construction facing layoffs? Understanding this crisis requires a detailed look at the history of the U.S.-Canada lumber dispute. Canada is the world's largest exporter of softwood lumber, providing roughly 1/3 of the lumber used in the United States. The U.S. government has long argued that Canadian producers benefit from government subsidies, such as below-market stumpage fees, the prices paid for harvesting timber on public lands, which give Canadian companies an unfair advantage. In response, the U.S. has repeatedly imposed tariffs to level the playing field. The Trump administration raised these tariffs to levels above 20%, one of the highest in decades. While intended to protect American jobs, these tariffs caused lumber prices to soar to unprecedented highs. At certain points, lumber prices more than doubled compared to periods before the tariffs. The consequences of these price spikes are felt across the economy but are most pronounced in housing construction. Lumber is a fundamental building material, used in framing houses, flooring, roofing, and more. When lumber prices rise sharply, the cost to build new homes increases accordingly. Builders and developers face increased expenses, often forcing them to delay or cancel projects. This reduces the supply of new homes at a time when demand remains high, contributing to rising home prices and worsening affordability. Moreover, the rise in lumber costs doesn't only affect those building new homes. Higher building expenses ripple through the market, affecting renovations, repairs, and even rental housing construction. This means renters, many already struggling with rising rents, face further challenges as landlords pass on increased costs. The timber giant's collapse amplifies this problem. Faced with soaring operational costs, supply chain difficulties, and reduced demand, this once stable company filed for bankruptcy, resulting in job losses and a tighter lumber market. As a major supplier, its failure exacerbates supply shortages and drives prices even higher. As we dive deeper into this story, we'll hear from industry experts, homebuyers, economists, and policymakers. We'll explore how the tariffs intended to protect American workers may have inadvertently harmed the broader housing market and everyday consumers. We'll analyze data on lumber prices, housing starts, mortgage rates, and affordability trends. Finally, we'll look at the path forward, potential solutions to the crisis, including tariff adjustments, boosting domestic timber production, sustainable forestry investments, and policies to encourage affordable housing construction. This is more than a story about trade or economics. It's about the American dream. Itself, the dream of owning a home, building a stable life, and growing communities. The crisis unfolding in the lumber and housing markets threatens that dream for millions. Understanding the causes and consequences is the first step to finding solutions that restore hope and opportunity. The trade relationship between the United States and Canada regarding softwood lumber is complex, long-standing, and filled with conflict. To fully grasp the current crisis, it's essential to understand the history of this dispute and the role tariffs have played over the years. Softwood lumber is one of Canada's largest exports and a vital resource for the U.S. construction industry. Roughly 1/3 of all lumber consumed in the United States is imported from Canada. This has made the lumber trade a key economic and political issue for both countries. The root of the dispute centers on allegations that Canadian lumber producers benefit from government subsidies that artificially lower the cost of timber. Of Canada's forest land is publicly owned, and companies pay stumpage fees to harvest timber. The U.S. government argues that these fees are set below market value, constituting an unfair subsidy that allows Canadian producers to sell lumber cheaper than American competitors. This argument has led to a series of legal battles, tariffs, and negotiations spanning several decades. The U.S. Department of Commerce has repeatedly imposed duties on Canadian lumber imports to offset the alleged subsidies, and dumping selling goods below cost to gain market share. The Trump administration escalated these measures dramatically. In 2020, tariffs were raised to over 20%, one of the highest levels in recent history. The administration asserted that this action would protect American lumber producers and jobs. However, many economists and industry insiders questioned whether such high tariffs were beneficial. While the tariffs raised the price of Canadian lumber, they also caused domestic lumber prices to skyrocket. The increase in costs for builders and developers reverberated through the housing market. Contributing to higher home prices, Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs on American goods, further straining trade relations. The dispute has sparked calls for renegotiations and highlighted the delicate balance between protecting domestic industries and ensuring affordable prices for consumers. Critics argue that the tariffs are a blunt instrument that harms American consumers and the broader economy more than Canadian producers. Builders face higher material costs, which slow construction and reduce the number of new homes entering the market. This tightening supply contributes to the affordability crisis plaguing many U.S. cities. Supporters of the tariffs maintain they are necessary to prevent unfair competition and protect American jobs in forestry and manufacturing. They warn that without tariffs, Canadian producers could dominate the market, putting domestic mills and workers at risk. The debate is further complicated by the global nature of supply chains and fluctuating market demands. Lumber prices also depend on factors like housing demand, transportation costs, and natural disasters affecting timber supply. Understanding this nuanced dispute requires examining the economic, political, and social forces at play. It highlights the challenges policymakers face when balancing trade fairness with the needs of consumers and industries. In the coming sections, we will see how these trade tensions, tariffs, and policy decisions have manifested in real consequences for the U.S. housing market and why the collapse of a timber giant may mark a turning point in this ongoing saga. Since the Trump administration raised tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber to over 20%, lumber prices in the United States have seen unprecedented spikes. These price hikes have had cascading effects throughout the construction industry and the broader housing market. To understand why lumber prices have surged so dramatically, it's important to consider the mechanics of tariffs and supply-demand dynamics. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods. When the U.S. government imposes tariffs on Canadian lumber, it increases the cost for importers who must pay these fees. This cost is then passed along to wholesalers, builders, and ultimately homebuyers. Canada is a major supplier. It's providing about 1/3 of the lumber consumed in the U.S. market. When tariffs make Canadian lumber more expensive, domestic suppliers might increase prices as well, knowing that buyers have fewer alternatives. Additionally, Tariffs can reduce the volume of lumber imported from Canada. If importing lumber becomes too costly, buyers may seek to purchase domestically. But US timber production is limited and cannot fully meet demand. This supply shortage drives prices higher. The COVID-19 pandemic further complicated matters. In the early months of the pandemic, lumber prices briefly dropped as construction slowed. But as demand rebounded faster than supply, lumber prices skyrocketed. Tariffs exacerbated this imbalance. Data from recent years shows lumber prices reaching highs that dwarf historical norms. At their peak, prices more than doubled compared to pre-pandemic levels. With some types of lumber reaching record prices, for home builders, these price surges translate into significantly higher construction costs. Lumber is one of the most important raw materials for residential construction, used in framing walls, floors, and roofs. With lumber costs rising, many builders have had to adjust budgets or postpone projects. For smaller developers and contractors, these increased expenses can make projects financially unviable. The price volatility also adds uncertainty to the housing market. Builders cannot easily predict costs, leading to caution and slower construction starts. This slowdown in housing supply coincides with increased demand, pushing home prices higher. For buyers, the result is less inventory and higher prices. The impact also extends to renovations and home repairs. Higher lumber costs mean increased expenses for homeowners, maintaining or upgrading their properties. Some builders have tried to adapt by seeking alternative materials or suppliers, but these options are often limited or come with their own challenges. Economists warn that if tariffs remain high and supply chain issues persist, lumber prices could stay elevated, prolonging affordability challenges. Ultimately, while tariffs were intended to protect American lumber producers, their effect has been to increase prices for consumers and slow the construction of new homes, outcomes that run counter to the policy's goals. Asterisk. The collapse of one of America's largest timber companies has sent shockwaves through the lumber and housing industries, highlighting the fragile state of the supply chain amid rising costs and market pressures. This company, which had operated as a dominant player for decades, faced a perfect storm of challenges culminating in its bankruptcy. Several factors contributed to the downfall. First, soaring lumber prices driven by tariffs and supply shortages raised operational costs for timber producers. While it might seem that higher prices would boost profits, the reality is more complex. The company struggled with volatile prices that made budgeting and planning difficult. Sharp price fluctuations created uncertainty that hindered long-term contracts and investments. Second, the timber giant was heavily leveraged, carrying significant debt loads. The combination of high fixed costs and unpredictable revenues placed enormous financial strain on the business. When demand softened due to rising home prices and slower construction starts, cash flow tightened. Third, supply chain disruptions exacerbated the company's difficulties. Transportation bottlenecks, labor shortages, and delays in logging and milling operations reduced efficiency. These challenges increased costs and delayed deliveries to customers, damaging relationships with builders and distributors. Fourth, the trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada added another layer of complexity. Retaliatory tariffs and diplomatic friction created an unstable trade environment, making it harder to plan operations across borders. Ultimately, the company's bankruptcy led to thousands of layoffs, adding to economic stress in communities dependent on forestry jobs. The closure also reduced lumber supply at a time when demand remained strong, further tightening an already strained market. Industry analysts warn that the collapse of such a significant supplier creates ripple effects far beyond the company itself. Lumber availability declines, prices spike, and construction projects face delays or cancellations. This disruption compounds the challenges caused by tariffs and high demand. For home builders, the loss of a major supplier means fewer options and increased costs. Smaller and regional mills cannot always fill the gap, leading to localized shortages. This creates bottlenecks that slow home building nationwide. The timing of this collapse could not be worse. It's coinciding with a housing market already stressed by affordability issues and rising mortgage rates. It's the shortage of affordable homes, particularly for first-time buyers, grows more severe with every delayed project. Communities relying on timber industry jobs face economic uncertainty. The ripple effects touch local economies, from logging towns to construction hubs, affecting everything from retail sales to tax revenues. The collapse underscores the vulnerabilities in the lumber supply chain, highlighting how trade policy, market forces, and operational challenges can converge with devastating consequences. Going forward, the industry faces a critical juncture: rebuilding supply chains, stabilizing prices, and restoring confidence among builders and consumers will require coordinated efforts from policymakers, businesses, and communities. The fallout from rising lumber prices, tariffs, and the collapse of key suppliers is most visible in the U.S. housing market, a sector vital to the economy and to millions of Americans' dreams of homeownership. Housing affordability is already under pressure before these recent shocks. Decades of underbuilding, rising population, and increased urbanization have led to chronic shortages in many markets. Pushing prices higher, the surge in lumber costs adds a new and powerful force, driving prices up. Lumber accounts for a significant portion of the cost of building a new home. Estimates suggest around 10 to 15%, or more of total construction expenses. When lumber prices double or triple, builders face tough choices. Many have had to delay or cancel projects because costs exceed budgets. Others have passed increased expenses onto buyers, leading to more expensive homes. This reduction in housing supply exacerbates competition among buyers, further driving up prices and limiting options. The National Association of Home Builders reports that housing starts, the number of new residential construction projects started, have declined in recent months. Rising mortgage rates compound the problem. As the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to combat inflation, borrowing costs for homebuyers increase. Higher mortgage payments reduce affordability and discourage some buyers from entering the market. Renters also feel the squeeze. Limited housing supply leads to rising rents, pushing many families to the brink of housing insecurity. Affordable rental units are in short supply, and increasing demand puts upward pressure on prices. The cumulative effect of these trends is a housing crisis that touches many Americans. First-time homebuyers face barriers to entry, often unable to save enough for down payments or find homes within their budgets. Middle-income families struggle with rising costs, while low-income households risk displacement. The economic consequences extend beyond individual families. Housing construction is a major source of jobs, from carpenters and electricians to suppliers and real estate agents. When construction slows, job growth suffers, affecting local economies. In addition, high housing costs reduce disposable income, limiting spending on other goods and services and slowing overall economic growth. The housing market also plays a critical role in wealth building. For many families, homeownership is their primary asset and source of financial security. Barriers to buying homes increase wealth inequality and reduce economic mobility. Policymakers face urgent challenges in addressing these interconnected problems. Reducing tariffs, supporting domestic lumber production, expanding affordable housing initiatives are part of the solution. Streamlining regulations and incentivizing development in high-demand areas can also help increase supply. Programs targeting first-time buyers with down payment assistance and lower interest rates may improve access. The stakes are high. Housing is not just a commodity. It is a cornerstone of community stability and opportunity. Ensuring that Americans can find safe, affordable homes is critical to social and economic well-being. The tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber and the resulting housing market turmoil have become a flashpoint in U.S. political debates. At the heart of the controversy is a fundamental question: how should the U.S. balance protecting domestic industries with ensuring affordable housing and fair trade? Supporters of the tariffs argue they are necessary to defend American jobs in forestry and lumber milling. They maintain that Canadian producers benefit from unfair subsidies, and without tariffs, U.S. mills would be undercut, leading to job losses and industry decline. This view is supported by labor unions and some politicians representing timber-producing states, who emphasize the importance of maintaining domestic C2Z's manufacturing capacity. Opponents of the tariffs point to the skyrocketing lumber prices and the detrimental impact on homebuyers and builders. They argue that tariffs have backfired by raising costs, slowing construction, and worsening housing affordability. Many economists suggest that tariffs, while well-intentioned, are a blunt instrument that fails to consider downstream effects on consumers and the broader economy. The debate also reflects larger questions about trade policy under the Trump administration and moving forward. While tariffs can be a tool for protecting industries, they carry risks of retaliation and unintended consequences. Some policymakers advocate for renegotiating trade agreements with Canada to address subsidy concerns without resorting to high tariffs. Others push for more nuanced policies that balance fair competition with market stability. In Congress, bipartisan discussions continue over how to support both American workers and housing affordability. Proposed solutions include tariff reductions, incentives for domestic timber production, and expanded housing funding. The Biden administration faces pressure to navigate these competing interests carefully. The administration has already taken steps to review tariffs and engage in trade talks with Canada. Meanwhile, industry groups, housing advocates, and consumer organizations are calling for urgent action to prevent further damage to the housing market. The political debate underscores the complexity of trade policy, where decisions made at the border have far-reaching effects on everyday lives. It highlights the need for policies that consider entire supply chains and the needs of diverse stakeholders. As the debate unfolds, the decisions made in Washington will shape the future of the lumber industry, housing affordability, and the economic well-being of millions of Americans. Asterisk, as the American housing market grapples with soaring lumber prices, reduced supply, and the collapse of key industry players, policymakers, businesses, and communities are searching for effective solutions. Addressing this multifaceted crisis requires coordinated action on several fronts, from trade policy adjustments to domestic production boosts, sustainable forestry, and affordable housing initiatives. One of the most immediate and debated options is renegotiating or reducing tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber. The tariffs set at over 20% during the previous administration have been a major driver of price increases. Many economists and industry groups argue that lowering or removing these tariffs would reduce lumber prices, easing construction costs and improving housing affordability. However, renegotiation is complex. The underlying trade dispute centers on allegations of unfair Canadian subsidies, which the U.S. aims to address without destabilizing the market. Effective negotiations would require compromises that ensure a level playing field for American producers while minimizing harm to consumers and builders. Increasing domestic timber production is another critical strategy. The U.S. forestry industry has faced challenges including regulatory hurdles, aging infrastructure, and environmental concerns. Investing in modernizing mills, expanding sustainable logging practices, and incentivizing new production could reduce dependence on imports and stabilize supply. Sustainable forestry is key to long-term success. Ensuring that timber harvesting balances environmental protection with economic needs supports ecosystem health and industry viability. Advances in forest management and reforestation efforts can help maintain a steady supply of raw materials. Beyond supply-side measures, expanding affordable housing initiatives is essential. Government programs that support construction of low and moderate-income housing, streamline permitting, and encourage innovative building techniques can boost supply and accessibility. Some experts advocate for increased use of alternative building materials like engineered wood products or even non-wood options, which may alleviate pressure on traditional lumber. Financial assistance programs for first-time buyers, such as down payment help or subsidized mortgage rates, can also improve access in a high-cost market. Collaboration between federal, state, and local governments, industry stakeholders, and community groups will be vital. Policies must address the entire housing ecosystem, considering supply chains, labor markets, finance, and demand dynamics. Looking ahead, market forces and policy decisions will shape how quickly the housing market recovers. Without action, high lumber prices and constrained supply risk, prolonging affordability challenges, economic uncertainty, and social strain. However, coordinated efforts offer hope. Reducing tariffs, boosting domestic production, investing in sustainability, and supporting affordable housing could help stabilize the market and restore the American dream of homeownership for many families. Asterisk. Behind the statistics and policies are real people whose lives have been deeply affected by the lumber and housing crisis. Listening to their stories reveals the human side of a complex economic and political issue. First-time homebuyers face daunting barriers. Many have saved for years, dreaming of stable housing for their families, only to be priced out by soaring home costs. One young couple shared, "We thought buying a home was within reach. Prices keep rising, and every time we look, the homes are more expensive or out of our budget." Renters also feel the pressure. With fewer affordable units available, rents climb, forcing families to make tough choices between housing and other necessities. A single mother described her struggle. "I want to provide a safe home for my kids, but rent keeps going up, and it's hard to keep up with bills." Construction workers and timber industry employees have faced job insecurity amid the collapse of major companies in towns dependent on logging and milling jobs. Layoffs ripple through the economy, affecting local businesses and services. One mill worker said, "Losing this job is tough. It's how I support my family." We hope the industry recovers soon, but it's a hard time for everyone. Small builders and contractors report delays and cancellations due to lumber shortages and price volatility. A builder explained, "It's hard to plan when prices jump unpredictably. Sometimes we have to halt projects, which hurts our business and the people waiting for new homes." Communities dependent on construction and forestry face broader economic challenges as housing slows and jobs decline. Local governments see reduced tax revenues and increased demand for social services. Despite these hardships, many remain hopeful. Community organizations are working to provide assistance, advocate for affordable housing, and support displaced workers. These personal stories remind us that the housing and lumber crisis is not just an economic problem, it is a human challenge, requiring empathy, innovation, and action. The collapse of a major timber giant and the ensuing housing market turmoil have exposed vulnerabilities in America's trade policies, supply chains, and housing infrastructure. The tariffs intended to protect domestic industries have contributed to soaring lumber prices, supply shortages, and declining housing affordability. This crisis serves as a powerful reminder that trade and economic policies must be carefully balanced to serve the broader public interest. Protecting jobs is vital, but so is ensuring that Americans can afford safe, stable homes, a foundation for families and communities. As policymakers consider the future of tariffs and trade with Canada, they face difficult choices. Reducing tariffs could ease prices, but requires addressing long-standing subsidy concerns. Boosting domestic timber production and investing in sustainable forestry are critical for long-term stability. Meanwhile, addressing the housing shortage demands expanded affordable housing programs, regulatory reforms, and financial assistance for buyers. The American dream of homeownership, central to social and economic well-being, depends on solving these interconnected challenges. 4. Builders, workers, and families caught in this crisis, the path forward may seem uncertain. But with coordinated effort, informed policy, and community support, recovery and renewal are possible. The lessons learned from this crisis can guide future trade and housing policies, ensuring resilience and opportunity for generations to come. Thank you for following this detailed exploration of the timber collapse and housing market crisis. Stay tuned as we continue to monitor developments and bring you insights into the forces shaping our economy and lives.